hey, you already believe in God. What should follow from that if you're really talking about God with a capital G? And this can point to Perfect Being Theology, which is another thing that comes from Anselm.
What do you think of my thoughts on the importance of the argument for Christians?
Oh, yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said for that, what you're getting at there, where it has theological or maybe soteriological implications where, hey, you already believe in God. What should follow from that if you're really talking about God with a capital G? And this can point to Perfect Being Theology, which is another thing that comes from Anselm, that God is there's different ways of expressing this. Like Anselm said, the greatest thing that can be conceived, maximally great. I don't like the greatest thing that can be conceived because that ties the properties to what I can conceive. And I think God's got better properties than I can conceive. So maximally great is probably a little better. But the idea as I understand it is for any property that there is, if it's a good thing to have, God has it to the best degree possible. And so like with power, is it better to be able to lift 200 pounds than 100 pounds? Obviously. Is it better to be able to lift 500 than 200? Well, obviously. And you go up and up and up, and eventually you reach whatever the maximum possible amount of power is, and that's what we should attribute to God. And same with benevolence and omniscience and whatever other transcendent categories we'd apply to him. But it's usually those 3 O's and some, I would add necessity as well. So,
Yeah. So I like how you're doing that. You're saying, okay, is it better to love one person or two persons? Is it better to love two persons or 10 persons? Is it better to love 10 persons or everybody? You know, it just seems like, you know, and these are conclusions that we can get apart from this too. It seems biblical that we can make a case for God's perfection and that he is a maximally great being from Scripture alone. We don't need the ontological argument. But then there's debate. I mean, you look at A.W. Pink and he says, no, God does not love everyone. You know, he's a well-known Calvinist theologian. He said, no, God's not, basically saying God's not omnibenevolent. All right. Then you've got other, you know, let me pick on some Calvinists right now. You've got other Calvinists who will say, well, no, not only does not God, or God doesn't love everyone, but I've argued that John Piper inadvertently has argued for, or that God's not omnipotent. He doesn't mean to, but in my book, I discuss why I think he's accidentally done this. And then you've got others from some Calvinists like James White, who will say that God doesn't, he's not omniscient. What he means by omniscience is, or he would at least say that God's not necessarily omniscient, because on his view, God has to determine the truth value to every proposition. So that's all up to God. Well, that means that logically prior to God determining the truth value to every proposition, God literally knows nothing. I think that's a low, right?
That seems to have absurd implications, and maybe he hasn't quite pushed that out as much as he should. So
exactly. And of course, open theists, they don't think that God, you know, knows the future. And if he doesn't know the future, he doesn't know all the possible futures that he could.
They try and get around that though by saying there's no knowledge about the future. So they would. I know some people have said open theists are heretical, and maybe some of them are, but in my mind, I'm like, well, I don't think we have a disagreement about the nature of God. We have a disagreement about what's nature of the future is. And I don't buy their arguments that you can't have knowledge of the future, because it seems intuitively obvious to me that I do. I knew yesterday that I was going to talk to you today. I had good reasons for it. I was justified. It's true because now I'm talking to you, and I believed it. I had justified true belief that I was going to talk to Tim today. I had knowledge about the future. If I can have it, why can't God?
I agree. And I think, you know, I'm aware of the open theists' arguments. They want to say, no, we do claim that God is omniscient and a maximally great being. But I also, in my book, you know, in this book here, I argue that it is greater for God to be able to, you know, it's greater for God to have middle knowledge than to not have middle knowledge. But but again, they're going to say, well, it's just impossible to have it. So that's where the debate is. So I'm not trying to throw them under the bus right now. I do know, I'm aware of their arguments against it. But I do think when we think of God as a maximally great being, I say, look, if God is necessarily omnipotent, then he can create humans, he can create creatures with libertarian freedom. He's got that power. If God is necessarily omniscient, then God knows how these free creatures would freely choose if he were to create them, and even if he never does. So therefore, if God is necessarily omnipotent and necessarily omniscient, and the decree is contingent, then God has middle knowledge. Middle knowledge comes along for the ride. So that's one reason why I'm a Molinist. Definitely not the only reason, but it's a contributing factor.
Yeah, I do like that. Middle knowledge is one of those things that seems intuitively obvious to me.